Hello, welcome to the 2020 Virtual United Nations World Data Forum, to this session on fiscal responses to a COVID-19 emergency. My name is Juan Pablo Guerrero. I'm the Network Director of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, a network integrated by governments, international financial institutions, civil society organizations, and expert institutions that work on advancing fiscal transparency around the world. The panel that we have today addresses one of the very important ways to face those challenges, and that is transparency. I am very pleased to introduce a wonderful group of colleagues who are going to be discussing about ways to address with transparency and taking into consideration the users of information, the challenges of fiscal response to COVID-19. As you know, the need to use and apply, execute fiscal resources has been very important. The challenge is how to do it in a way that you can address the problem and at the same time to be transparent. To discuss this very important topic, we're going to start looking at the state of transparency before COVID-19 hit the world economy. And for that, Suad Hassan from the International Budget Partnership will be briefly talking about the Open Budget Survey. I will talk a little bit more about Suad in a second. Let me just introduce our panel for everyone to know the structure of our discussion. After Suad, we're going to hear from Pedro Aristi, an economist at the World Bank, who's going to be identifying the importance of fiscal data for governance. We believe that transparency is not only important for public financial management, it is also important for governance as a whole, and Pedro will be talking about that. After that, Lorena Rivero, GIFT program manager for cooperation, technical and knowledge issues, will be presenting an effort of the GIFT network to address fiscal transparency in times of emergency. We will have, after that, the look at these issues from civil society with the presence and presentation of Suki, who will be presenting on particularly the experience of South Africa. Suki Zwakota from the Monitoring and Advocacy Program of Public Service Accountability Monitor. And finally, I am very pleased to tell you that Leonardo Buitrago from the Ministry of Finance in Colombia will be also part of discussion, complementing the general oversee of what we will be talking about with a very specific example from Colombia. So, without further ado, let me introduce Suad Hassan, Program Officer at the International Budget Partnership. As you probably know, IBP has been producing for several years now the Open Budget Survey. And just few months before the pandemic hit the world, IBP finished the 2019 edition of the OBS. Suad, you have 10 minutes and all of the presenters are gonna have 10 minutes to discuss the topics, and then we're gonna go into general questions and a more general discussion. Please, Suad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I'm going to try and stick to 10 minutes. Here, let me just share my screen. So I don't think I need to go over why open budgets are important. And as Juan Pablo briefly mentioned about what the Open Budget Survey assesses, as we all know, IBP has been making the case for transparency for over 20 years, and we're seeing, especially during a crisis, it has become critical that there is transparency in government expenditure as well as policies. And we strongly believe, of course, that open budgets are critical to support efficient resource allocation, improve service delivery, earn public trust, and also be a reflection of government's policies on inequality and poverty. So it's in this spirit that the Open Budget Survey was launched in 2006, as Juan Pablo mentioned. It's a biennial survey, and we assess three key aspects. Before that, I just want to say that it's an evidence-based assessment drawing from international standards. And so, and we create an index, a score, which is called the Open Budget Score, the Open Budget Index, which is a measure from 0 to 100 of transparency in how public resources are raised and spent. The second pillar in our survey is the opportunities for participation in budget policy decisions. And the third is oversight in the budget process by independent legislatures and audit institutions. So the most recent round of the survey was released, as Juan Pablo mentioned, just earlier this year, somewhere in April 2020. However, the research was conducted prior to the pandemic. In fact, as we were writing the global report is when the world was hit with the pandemic. And here is what we see in terms of the result of the most recent survey. This is a heat map. The global average for Open Budget Survey 2019 is 45 out of a maximal possible of 100. So what this shows is that while the world has been making modest gains over the years, the global average of 45 means that the information provided is rather limited. To give you some context, the way the indicators are built in the Open Budget Survey, a score of 61 on 100, 61 or more, implies that there is sufficient information provided by governments for citizens to meaningfully engage in any decisions, in policy discussions. As you can see from this heat map, greater green, more green meaning there is more information available, and red meaning that there is very little information available. The other trend, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are modest gains. As you can see for the global average score, right from the beginning of Open Budget Survey, the increase has been really modest. And so what this goes to show is that if we don't take drastic action, really it might be decades before the world reaches an average of 61, which is what we consider sufficient for any kind of meaningful discussion. So there is need to, while the improvements are modest and the direction, the trajectory is positive, there's really need for it to be leaner and greater improvements per year. The second finding I want to discuss, which is relevant to this forum, is the problem of volatility that we have noticed in the Open Budget Survey findings since the beginning. By volatility, I mean that the changes are not sustained or the improvements are not sustained. So the Open Budget Survey assesses the public availability and comprehensiveness of 8 key budget documents that should be published in an annual budget cycle. These are the 8 key budget documents mentioned here. Without going into the nitty-gritties, as you can see, there are positive improvements in the number of documents that countries publish, but there are also changes, which implies that whatever improvements are made are not necessarily sustained from year to year. So there's really a need for this kind of sustainability so that the practices are sustained and the volatility problem is reduced. I think this problem, one wonders, is compounded even more during a crisis when decisions are taken rather quickly. The third finding we find in the Open Budget Survey is that there is more information published on budget plans than there is during budget execution. This problem, as we find, is further compounded by gaps in oversight, which is another pillar of the survey. As you can see here, only 30 countries out of 117 provide adequate oversight by the legislature as well as the Audit Institute. So going back, so we see that the amount of information available during budget execution is much less than during budget plans. And during this crisis, we're seeing that there is international consensus on transparency. We know that GIFT has published a guide, and as IMF has been saying, do whatever it takes, but publish the receipts. IBP is saying, IMF is saying, do whatever it takes, but keep the receipts. IBP is saying, also publish the receipts. And two things I want to, deviating a little bit from the global results, two quick points I want to mention from the details within the Open Budget Survey that I think are relevant to this forum. Our findings on our indicators related to impact of budget policies on poverty and inequality. As Juan Pablo mentioned in the opening, World Bank has estimated that almost 71 to 100 million people may be pushed into poverty and inequality. And our survey has indicators that ask how much do governments publish this information in their budget proposal as well as budget execution documents. And the findings are rather dismal. We find that only a third of the countries that even do publish the budget proposal publish any kind of information on the impact of policies on poverty and inequality. And during monitoring, only a fifth of the countries that do publish their annual reports publish information on the impact of budget policies. So this is one area that could truly benefit from improvement in practice, especially in light of this crisis. Now, to leave on a positive note, one thing that we assess in the Open Budget Survey but do not include in the score is information on machine readable data. So we see that over the years, including in this round, this is a growing practice, which is a really good sign. By machine readable data, we are assessing portals as well as information that can be easily analyzed by civil society organizations. I mean, we all know gone are the days where citizens need to manually, not just citizens, but general public needs to manually sit down and analyze data from printed PDFs. So the Open Budget Survey most recent round showed that there was a 24% increase in the availability of machine readable data. And as we can see, this has really been used during the COVID-19 crisis, where governments are publishing this, whoever had that set up is publishing information in real time. And not just governments, we're also seeing that civil society is able to engage and track expenditures wherever this information is publicly available. So lastly, I just want to touch upon it quickly, just in the spirit of the Open Budget Survey results for 2019. We find that participation mechanisms are also rather low in this world during budget execution. The global average for public participation is a 14 out of a maximum possible of 100. Again, we find that participation is more common during budget formulation than budget execution. Lastly, the Open Budget Survey team, as well as IBP, have published a call to action for open budgets. As we saw, the progress is so modest that if we don't do something now, it may take a really long time, decades before we reach any kind of meaningful progress in budget transparency. So IBP has published a call to action to open budgets. You can find the URL below. We encourage you all to come and join us and sign up. Thank you.
Thank you, Suad. And thank you for inviting us to join this very important call. So the world was facing challenges regarding the state of open budgets, participation, accountability issues, and then COVID hit us. What we have seen since then is that resources has been used, but we're not always sure that the receipts have been kept, and we know that in many cases they have not been published. Now, the question for Pedro Aristi is, why is this important for the way governments deliver, respond to social needs, and why is transparency, particularly in the time of emergency, at the core of the governance issues? So Pedro Aristi, economist and officer from the World Bank with a very long experience on governance and transparency, accountability issues around the world. Please, Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. And well, thank you for having me. Thanks to the UN and to GIFT. It's a real pleasure to be sharing this panel. This is something that we feel passionate about. I work at the bank, at the World Bank, at practice that's called governance, and one of the pillars of it is accountability and transparency. So this is a very big part of the business that we do. So one of the things that I didn't want to bring is to basically explain how much the bank has supported these initiatives and bring some examples, because I think we have better people prepared to talk about that. I wanted to somehow do it a bit more complex, controversial, but on something that at least is bothering me a lot these days and during the COVID pandemic, most of this year, which is the issue of the link between information and fiscal transparency and trust specifically in government. Let me share a couple of slides that I have just to lead the conversation. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so basically, I mean, I wanted to open the issue of, I feel that the age of COVID is the age of distrust, and specifically distrust in our governments and in what they say and their data. I mean, the issue of trust and the crisis of trust has been happening for a while. You can see the public trust plummeting in the US over a long period of time. This is not something that we should say is a recent, but I feel that is particularly relevant now, and it's deteriorating even further. It varies by country. Scandinavian countries have much more trust in government that other Latin American countries do have. But in general, there's been a trend in the decrease. And although in recent years it's been fairly stable, it's still decreasing. And I feel that this is important. Important because I see that over this pandemic, particularly issues of feelings and beliefs are driving the policy debate and the conversations among people. This, what you have in front of you, is a survey across countries that was done in March, in which one of the questions was, I believe the threat from the coronavirus is exaggerated. And you will see that across countries, majority of people think that. Is that true? Is this evidence? Not? Well, I guess the jury is still there. But here my point is that the conversations between individuals within the government, with the government, and the general distrust on what the government is doing, and also the legitimacy for the government to carry on some things, gets compromised, not by evidence and by our fiscal data, but sometimes by the beliefs that people have. And this is important. However, people still go to government systems and platforms to get the information. What you have there is a survey that was done also across some countries in March and April, I think, on the question, which, if any, of the following have you used in the last week as a source of news or information about COVID-19? And not surprisingly, the number one is the news organizations, but the government and agencies remain a primary source of information. So we have the demand, we have the interest. So even though we distrust our governments, we still go and hear and download information that comes from them. Here, basically, the point is that trust is important, it matters, it's relevant. And this is the point that I want to raise. Our societies and the relationship we have as individuals, as neighbors, between individuals and firms, with the government, requires trust for social cohesion, for cooperation, for raising investment, for well-being, which in the age of COVID, and the recovery that is not only economic, but also social, is important. And measuring trust is very difficult. It's kind of tricky. But the recent research that we have, the bank has done some work, but mostly the OECD has been doing it. They have a trust lab on this, and I have been following them a bit, is that there are some drivers for trust, and particularly for trust in governments. I mean, they talk about responsiveness, reliability, integrity, openness, and fairness. Now, responsiveness understood as whether the government is providing the services or not. Reliability, if they anticipate the change, if they are protecting the citizens themselves. Integrity, whether they're using the resources, the money, the power in an ethical way. Here, particularly important in our discussion today is openness. Are they listening? Are they consulting, engaging, explaining, disseminating information? And fairness, on whether they are actually catering to everyone and not just some of them. Also, I saw very recently a presentation by Ipsos Mori, the research market research firm that has done some work and has identified in their front, 8 drivers. One of them was open and transparent government, which also actually featured very, very badly in terms of how much people trust. So trust is important, and fiscal information and the link to trust is also important. My point here is that fiscal transparency, we have an opportunity, can play a critical role in raising trust. There are a number of things that we have to learn more about and be very savvy about. Trust can be eroded very easily. We've seen it with media, we've seen it with political polarization, even with concessions to the corporate world during the crisis that can make trust plummet very easily in government, in institutions. That it varies is complex. It varies a lot depending on the context. And the relationship between trust and information is tricky. Sometimes more information can lead to less trust. Think of the police videos that we've seen and corruption scandals. You provide more information, trust goes down, at least initially. So it's not linear. And sometimes the other way around, there's very authoritarian states where trust in government is very high. Is that indoctrination? In any way, it is not linear. And some people argue, rightly so, that some level of mistrust in government is actually healthy. So the optimal level of trust is definitely not 100%. Nevertheless, the point here that I want to raise today is that fiscal transparency and fiscal data and the way we use it and disclose it can be a pillar for trust. And we need trust. It's relevant. And particularly in a moment in which we are somehow recovering, we're recovering both economically and socially over the next months or years, building stronger institutions. It's important when we solidify that with institutions that we can trust. Trust in government is as important as ever. Perhaps the punchline here is not that we should continue, and when I think of my own role at the World Bank in business as usual, I think we've done a lot, but I think we have to do more. And I wanted to leave you with some considerations of things that we might have to do perhaps differently. In the work that we've done, and I have 5 points that I want to raise before I finish, is that I've seen a lot of efforts in fiscal transparency and disclosure, but sometimes not accompanied, but a lot of efforts in analyzing and evaluating the use of data. No, another tricky measure. Using and avoiding what I call here, or what's being called, the data graveyards. I feel that putting efforts in actually measuring and evaluating that, it's very important in our efforts as we move forward. Another one is that many of the efforts that we do are sometimes, or start at least at the national level, at the federal union level, and doesn't reach so much disclosure at the local level. I feel that there the feedback loops are closer, and there's a greater opportunity even to raise trust, given the close relationship between the local governments and the citizens themselves. So I feel that the feedback loops are closer, and we have a big opportunity there really to put more efforts at the local level. In many cases, this has been successful, and in others not. User friendliness of data, and also the linkage to outcome, to impact. Sometimes just fiscal transparency by itself is not very meaningful, maybe not for us that we are economists and so, but really making sure that we can convey how those resources are actually playing a role in programs, in projects, in the daily services and lives of the people. I think we have to intensify that. This is perhaps maybe the point that should be in first position during the COVID-19, depolarizing, depoliticizing the use of data, very worrisome. I think that we have a role in promoting a cadre of bureaucrats and specialists, and the professionalization of these people, so that they can safeguard, the data generation process, the integrity, and the independence of those institutions, not only organizations, but as a broader sense of the word. And finally, I think we have to do more on the process of data audits and control systems to make sure that we verify the quality. It's a bit linked also with the previous point. We need to trust, but we need to verify as well. I think I will leave it here. I wanted to just finish by saying also that the Manca's work on probably in another session will be formally presented, a COVID-19 response tracking portal that has what attempts to have many of the actions that countries, sometimes with World Bank support or not, on initiatives to really protect the health and livelihood of citizens and economies across the world in the context of the COVID-19. This is accessible, and as of the end of September, there's over 1,700 records of measures that different countries have taken and organized by different themes. And with that, over to you, Juan Pablo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for setting very clearly some of the most some pressing challenges that we have on governance and its relationship with transparency and trust. So let me now move on to the challenges that some governments have. It is true that fiscal transparency has always an innate resistance to it. That happens with all organizations. But in many occasions, governments want to push this agenda, and they realize that it is difficult to push it forward. Many conditions have to be there. And about these conditions and these challenges, the GIFT Network has put together an effort to guide governments on how to respond facing emergency with their budget, fiscal, and other very important data sources that are needed to respond in a very transparent way. For this, Lorena Rivero, Gift Manager for Technical Knowledge and Collaboration Affairs, led a very important effort within the Gift Network to produce a guide for COVID-19 responses. Lorena, please tell us about this effort and the advantages it proposes for governments that are seeking fiscal transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you everyone for being here and sharing with us. So I'm going to be introducing the Fiscal Data for Emergencies response. Once my computer is working, there we go. That we have been working on. First of all, I wanted to frame and sometimes remind us why fiscal openness is necessary in times of emergency. So in general, I'm not speaking only about COVID-19. That's the emergency that we have in face right now, that we have in hand right now, and everyone is thinking about COVID. But climate change is also actually creating more and more emergencies every time, and we see local emergencies coming up. So why is fiscal openness actually important in times of emergency, more in a broader context? So first of all is every country implements measures, right? These measures are sometimes to improve or help improving the conditions of certain group, but this can affect other aspects of public finances or other groups because there are trade-offs. This is a budget or this is fiscal issues. So there are trade-offs. So we need the whole information to identify, yes, the good things, but also where did it come from? What was the impact? We need to identify sustainability and potential risks. So in the beginning of COVID-19, everyone was speaking about budgets and procurement, but then you start seeing the impact and the scale of the emergency. And this is not only about budgets. So keeping the receipts is important, but there's a whole context that we need to be seeing when we're speaking about the implementation of this. Then Pedro was just mentioning the importance of actually, what about the outcomes? Are we seeing how this is being implemented with efficiency, effectiveness? And this is times of fast decision making. Are we making the right decisions for efficiency and effectiveness, or are we just making fast decisions? Of course, what comes to the mind of many in this arena is, are we preventing and detecting corruption and mismanagement? Another thing is what measures are implemented right now, and saying that this is because of the pandemic. Are these just going to be implemented for the pandemic, or when are they supposed to be phasing out? This is important when we're speaking about debt and deficits and tax expenditures. So this becomes a bit more tricky than when we're just speaking about a budget transparency per se. And of course, as Swat was mentioning, we want a public participation, but we want to enable informed public participation. And that is not possible if we don't have fiscal openness. We can ask people to raise their hands and to vote, but if we don't give them information to analyze, how can we expect this? So what type of transparency are we expecting? And I wanted to show here, because this is a data forum, most countries are publishing or are saying that they have transparency and publishing decrees. And these decrees are important because they give a legal certainty. But this should be paired with data where these measures can be traced, the implementation can be tracked, And there are things in the decrees that are not specifically regulated, and you can only see the implementation throughout the specific detailed data. And relating to this, so we need a lot of data if we want to analyze these kind of things, if we want the needs and greeds of what is being implemented. And then, of course, we need to ask, is it because are countries not publishing because they don't want to? Or in many cases, they don't even have the data. And that's what Juan Pablo was mentioning right now. And so this forced us also to ask, do we have the data architecture that we need for fiscal transparency of data, with data to happen? So I'm posing here a couple of questions. Of course, we can ask a lot more. I'm just posing two for the existence of data and its architecture that I think that are the most relevant. And it's our governments gathering the data necessary to track decisions with clarity and evaluate implementation and impact. And is the data necessary for informed decision-making readily available? Sometimes they don't, governments might not even have the information or the data that they required for this fast decision-making. And related to the publication of this information, how are these decisions being informed? What's the level of detail that, that governments are publishing, and how can they assess the transparency of the implications? And one important thing, because many governments that have been working with us have been saying, well, yeah, we actually, our government is publishing a lot of data, and you have to go to this website, and then to this other one, and then to this other one. Okay, so then any citizen or any public that wants to analyze the data has to go to 15 websites and has to become an expert of not only public finances, but also of health, and also of how the different agencies decided to publish this data, because they're all doing it differently. So is this easily compiled? Or is it left to the user to assemble the puzzle? So thinking of all of this, that's how we came up with this effort of developing the fiscal data for emergency response. Right now, we have presented the version 1.1, and that is because of the process of compilation. The objective of this guide is to provide a practical tool that helps governments to know what data to gather internally. Sometimes you say, okay, I have certain information, and then you bump into a wall and you see that you don't have enough information that you would like to have. And to analyze the processes of gathering this data. And then from the side of publication is simplifying the identification of what data is required for good fiscal transparency that is meaningful, as Pedro was saying, not to have data graveyards, and that it's meaningful publication. So this guide has been developed in our co-creation process with many ministries of finance, civil society organizations, and international institutions that have been part of this process of how do we capture not just the budget, but the whole fiscal space, fiscal arena or context in these emergencies. So we have structured the guide in 3 sections. That's a user-centered and purpose-oriented approach of fiscal transparency. The second, that's the core or most mentioned one, is the identification of the required data. And the third one is a customization of the data and prioritization of the data. So this user-centered and purpose-oriented approach has to do with making fiscal data meaningful for the users. Who is going to use this and how can they use this? And section 2, we can see that it's not just about the emergency spending and counter-cyclical spending, but rather four important aspects that have to do with the whole fiscal context. It's emergency and counter-cyclical spending, tax relief measures and deferrals, revenue adjustments and additional funding sources, thinking about debt, international aid, humanitarian support that is being provided to countries. We also need transparency on that. And what is the impact of the macroeconomic framework? Because that's going to have implications not just for the moment, but for the next years to come. So here you can see the list of different data sets that are compiled under each of the pillars. You can see that they go from the adjusted budget and spending, not just the COVID-19 budget. Some countries are tagging in as part of their accounting, they're tagging the COVID-19 budget, but then you cannot see the trade-offs. So who lost, or are you just increasing the pie eternally? But also we have here, for example, public investments, which is important for hospital construction or other types of investments that are being done, or procurement that is on top of a lot of minds when we're discussing the purchases of medicines. Tax relief measures, because we need to know also who's benefiting from these measures. When we're thinking about equality, this is something who's bearing the cost of supporting businesses and who is getting the actual support. The revenue adjustments, and I was mentioning the part of the debt, but we also have to bear in mind that it's had a very important impact in oil prices. And that has had a very important impact in the revenue estimates of a lot of countries. So all this has changed, of course, the macroeconomic framework. And this is important when we are discussing how much are we gonna grow, but also what is the quality of the debt and any bonds that are gonna be emitted right now. So this is necessary to provide certainty on what's the stability and the risk management. So in total, it's 15 data sets plus 13 time series that are further disaggregated into 374 data fields, which is a lot, but it's all necessary for decision making, though it is more necessary, certain data sets or certain data fields are more necessary for some countries than for others. So we have added, section, okay, we have added section 3 with the country position, where we suggest how to analyze the country position, the data availability and quality, to assess where the country is standing and what is the most relevant data for the country, considering the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, and what considerations are there of this for the quality of financial management information systems, because we don't want just a reaction for now, but to plan for the future, because we want more resilient fiscal information systems in general. So that's a guide. We hope everyone uses it. And so it can be consulted here. Here's the link, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorena. One of the characteristics that I like the most about the guide is how well you were able to call to different stakeholders to be part of the effort. And particularly enthusiastic were civil society organizations. One of the characteristics of the work we do is when we talk about transparency, we always try to put around the table the suppliers of the budget information, but of course, who uses it, and particularly civil society. So I am very pleased to introduce for this discussion Sukiswa Kota, head of the Monitoring and Advocacy Program at the Public Service Accountability Monitor, PSAM, a member of the GIFT network, who has a great experience, not only in South Africa, but in many countries, about how you can advocate, sometimes in a very strong and demanding way, and sometimes in a very constructive way to make sure that governments move in the right direction towards producing information that is relevant for users. So what practices of fiscal openness have supported your work of analysis and monitoring public finance decisions during the pandemic response? Suki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, for this opportunity and to gift. Really excited to be on this panel. I'll restrain or restrict my my answer to our South Africa specific work for this forum, and I think just with starting with a very quick overview of the South Africa COVID-19 response context. The president announced a fiscal support package quite early, well, relatively early in April 2020, to do exactly what many other countries were doing. And the relief package is funded through a reprioritization, quite primarily, of the 2020-2021 budget, and by loans from funders, in the main, the African Development Bank, the New Development Bank, and of course the IMF being the primary external funders. There may be 4 key practices that I would say, or that I would cite as crucial enabling factors that have allowed us to interrogate and understand decision-making in the context of public finances, and with a particular lens on COVID-19. The first is access to budget information. Very much, leaning on what Swad shared with us earlier, the existing high levels of transparency at the provincial and national levels in our country have meant that we've been able to access with relative ease and without needing to start from scratch, as in some contexts it almost felt that way if I reflect on our other countries that we work in. So South Africa having quite a high ranking in terms of the OBS and fiscal transparency is a good thing and is an enabling environmental factor. The other is the increasing use of open data and online platforms. So I look here to examples, and I'll kind of have a quick screen share at the end. The one, and I think I was excited to see on Swad's sharing, is an open budget data portal called Vulega Mali, which is focused on provincial and national budget data and is in partnership with the National Treasury and civil society. Again, this issue of trust that I think Pedro touched on earlier. There's also a municipal money budget portal, and both of these are focused on the publication of budget data in accessible, user-friendly, and machine-readable formats. So for me, if I reflect even as early or as recently as 6 years ago, monitoring public budgets was significantly more challenging in the absence of these tools. And so even for their value as repositories of budget information, this one-stop shop that Lorena was speaking of earlier, invaluable and very strong enabling factors. The last 2 aspects in terms of positive factors or enabling factors, the one is, I think in the South African context, largely quite a robust and resourceful civil society context in which the kinds of partnerships that allow for deepening of transparency or like advocacy and partnerships has been very, very important. And I lean, for example, on some of the civil society coalitions that we are part of, including those that have been instrumental in the building of online budget portals. Lastly is the supportive ecosystems of state and non-state actors in public finance. So perhaps one of the most important lessons is around fiscal openness and transparency, and it is that some of the most effective ways of working is when multiple actors, both inside and outside the states, are able to work together wherever possible. And again, here the issue of trust is central, and I'm glad it's a theme that seems to be coming up in the context of data and open data and information sharing. And so the same is true of being able to draw on technical and peer learning support, for example, that's provided by GIFT for our work. So even while governments have been working in very uncertain timeframes, unpredictable environments, civic actors themselves have had to monitor the same work that the governments are doing, also under very demanding timeframes, also under high levels of uncertainty, and with some level of novelty and complexity. And so the external partnerships or the international partnerships in this context have been, really strong enablers. To now look at the issues perhaps that have undermined efforts, or practices that have posed challenges, if I can do that, Juan Pablo, the onset of the pandemic saw a mixed responsiveness in relation to policy and the legislative relief context in South Africa. So in the response to citizens by the government. And this is obviously true of many governments who suddenly, were faced with responding to largely an unknown virus, which until the 30th of January was deceptively this idea of being a virus that's constrained or confined to a couple of Asian countries. So in addition to normal transparency, proactive disclosure is vital during times of emergency. So how does the state decide how to channel funds, what resources, to whom, when, and by what means are all really important questions in this kind of mix. And so in this instance, a lack of centralized, uniformly categorized COVID-19 contract data, for instance, has been a significant barrier for monitoring and understanding the decisions that are made in response to COVID-19 has also been a barrier in preventative measures, or as far as possible, measures to safeguard misuse and maladministration. So for example, there are differences in our context in the presentation of this data from one province to another. We have 9 provinces, and each of those provinces is currently disseminating data in different ways. There's also differences within provinces between departments. So between the Department of Health and Education, the same COVID-19 response data, for example, is not easily comparable and easily trackable. And in fact, this issue of website hopping is exactly what we are finding, and is a significant barrier, as Lorena was saying in her observations. We've also found that some of the goods and services procured are listed quite explicitly and are named, and other times they are not, depending on the province you're looking at. We have found that listings in the context of procurement specifically, listing of directorships and company ownerships has been open and has been the case, but in one province, and in the other 8, not so much. And so again, we have issues of tracking. So even while the high levels of overall transparency, which I say still are really important, those have been vital. The degree of transparency and of availability and disaggregation of subnational and program level data, for instance, in education and health, have been challenges. There have been challenges before now and are now being particularly raised in the context of trying to understand the responses at sectoral level, at program level, and at subnational level. So over the years, the recommendations from the OBS and the Office of the Auditor General in South Africa, as well as in our own expenditure tracking, they could have served as meaningful preparation for an emergency like this if they had been adequately heeded and heeded in time, is our argument in part. So past sector reports of the Auditor General highlighted serious levels, for example, of irregular expenditure in subnational departments of health. So we have over the years recommended the improvement of data management and of expenditure reporting. Even before COVID-19, for us, the systemic problems are really important to address. And so COVID-19, here we go. So just to wrap up, the OBS has also consistently raised these issues of the need for deeper levels of public participation as a means to ensure bull's-eye planning and effective use of resources. And so again, here we found that there have been some serious weaknesses. So budgetary adjustments were necessary, we know this, and they were inevitable, but wherever possible, there should have been much deeper participation, and certainly much more detailed parliamentary briefings. And so there's this other layer of oversight that we feel there has been inadequate sharing. So by the time the minister tabled the adjustments budget specifically tailored for COVID relief, there were questions about the commitments that were made. For instance, the response to support small businesses. It wasn't clear where those funds would come from or what the long-term implications for defaulters would be, for instance. So the longer-term questions we were unable to answer. Closing off, so the increasing levels of open data and online publications I mentioned earlier is, in some ways, there has been a bit of an opportunity lost. It's definitely not too late, in the sense that these platforms can deepen the response and the readiness and dynamism of the response to COVID-19 if they are used, and if they are used to, again, as a central repository of key procurement, budget, but also information about how and what decisions are being made. And so both in this instance, Vulega Mali and municipal money to some extent are platforms that could be used. So for us, just to, what does keep the receipts mean? Two things in proper summary now. The first is that it's an opportunity not only to acknowledge weaknesses in key planning, budgeting, and oversight systems, but it's also a chance to use government interventions to address those. We think that transparency, accountability, and participation strategies are critical to solving many of these issues and to bolster the broader fiscal governance systems, beyond COVID-19. And it's also an opportunity to strengthen open data commitments in the fight to build back better. So in addition to continued work on existing budget data portals, we have in the interim developed COVID-19 contract tracking tool called the Receipts, or Keep the Receipts rather, which is a response to what we felt is a slower response in openness and publication from the state, but is one way in which civil society can perhaps share examples in the interim while we wait for the state to be responsive. I'll see if I can share in the interim, but yeah, that's me for now.
Thank you, Suki Kota. It's always very important for panels such as ours today to look at the South African experience. Not only because, as mentioned, it provides an example of a very open government, but also because at the same time it faces tremendous challenges, including, of course, capture, corruption, and still a lot of challenges regarding timely and relevant information for the public to use. So thank you for sharing that experience. And our panel could not be complete if we didn't have the voice of a government who has been facing such challenges and has been doing a very remarkable effort into facing the pandemic and at the same time providing timely information. Leonardo Buitrago, who is a computer science engineer and a director of the, as an advisor of the General Directorate of the Budget in Colombia. Let me ask you, what has helped your government to have better data internally and publish data for transparency purposes? Thank you, Leonardo, for your time.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. Thank you, the UN and GIFT. Really good friends and colleagues. I have to say, I have to mention for this answer to the question, I have to mention, we think, 7 factors which are important in this effort of giving meaningful and timely information for the public in related with public finances. The first factor is, I think we have very lucky in Colombia to have these 7 factors. The first one is an information system for all national budget finances, which is the name is see if this information system is working for the last decade in this version, the last version, and we have in this information system all 200 national agencies and their financial chain. So this is the first one. The second one is a transparency and information for citizens law, which is very important for us, and we know that it's already a trend, at least in the region. The third one is we have a national agency for all public contracting, national, regional, and local level. This national agency is maybe 9 years old, and this was part of a strategy to centralize all the information for public contracting at the beginning of the decade. Maybe the fourth factor is this national agency has this public contracting information system, and we have there any public contract with public money has to be registered in this information system in order to start the execution. So we have a centralized system for all these public contracts, and this contract, this information system for contracts, we are implementing the OCP standard, the Open Contracting Partnership standard, at least in the second version of this information system. So it's very good for us reaching the trends in standards for these public money contracting. The fifth one, we think we have this very good relationship between our Ministry of Finance and the Office of the General Controller. This is a recent achievement. In the first semester of this year, we have a very, very strong relationship, and this relationship gives the General Controller complete access to the financial information systems and the contracting information. So lately the scandals in the media about public contracting related with the COVID-19 is they are out. The scandals were in the news because of this relationship and the access that the General Controller has to our information system. I think the sixth factor that is that definitely the politicians and leaders in the first part of the decade, they were willing to be aligned with the principles of transparency and accountability. It was the first part of the decade because we already have another, we have this change in the presidency and the this new party and new president, they are not really very good friends of transparency, but this is another debate. And finally, last but not least, I have to mention that the seventh factor is we have constructed through the years, through the last years, a very good relationship with international organisms that support this transparency agenda and transparency processes in our country. And this, of course, give Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, Open Contracting Partnership, Open Knowledge Foundation, EITI for extractive industries, the OECD, the IBP, International Budget Partnership, the World Bank. All these organizations helped us very, very meaningful to give this information, to share experiences, and share this information with financial information that we have in order to the citizen to know the numbers. And also not on these international organisms, but we have already an agreement with some universities and national organizations of civil society, which have helped us a lot. I think these are the main factors in which we are very lucky. All these factors help to complement each other in order to have a very good environment for national agencies to publish information to citizens. And I would like very quickly to show two of our tools that give information and timely, mainly with daily updates sometimes, information specifically for COVID-19 pandemic, but also for any contracting in any sector, in any national agency. And very quickly, I will share the screen. We have this National Ministry of Finance portal. I hope that you can see right now.
You have 1 more minute, and yeah, now it's coming to the screen. Thank you.
Yeah, in the website of our ministry, we have this special report, COVID-19 report, which shows the main information about the pandemic, which the general numbers by sector, how much is the fund to face the pandemic and the emergency, what is the collection of the money, the money by sector, health, education, defense, finance, foreign affairs, meaningful bar graphics with all the relevant information. Also videos and images to show the main decisions of the central government and the decrease and loss, all the budget and different programs to face the pandemic. Finally, in our transparency portal, economic transparency portal, we have this special report, COVID-19, in order to know if the citizens want to know any detail about contracting and the numbers, the amounts are updating daily in order to know which contract is signed. The numbers are updated mainly in a daily basis. And all the information is available, and you can download this data. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leonardo, for sharing this experience from Colombia, which illustrates very well that this is an effort that requires a set of conditions that need to complement each other in order to guarantee a basic level of transparency for taxpayers and citizens to know how their money is being used. So let me now open up the floor for a general discussion with two main concerns. The first one regards the long-term implications of the pandemic for our field of fiscal transparency. Do you believe that 5 years from now, we will see the pandemic as a trigger for advancing in fiscal transparency? That would be the first question I would like us to discuss about. And the second one regards one obvious implication of the pandemic, and that is the impact on poor people. We know that there's going to be more marginalization, that inclusion is more of a challenge, not that some of us are benefiting from internet and this type of communication, but we know that most of the population are not and are left behind. So what would be your policy, your actions to reach out to those who were already laying behind and are completely isolated from these new ways of keeping the world going? So the floor is open, but we can start with you, Suad. Any thoughts on fiscal transparency in the medium term?
Thanks, Juan Pablo. To recall your question, so you're asking what would the impact of the pandemic for fiscal transparency in the medium term would be? I hesitate to make any kind of predictions, I'm sorry, but perhaps this is a good time to tell the viewers that the next round of the Open Budget Survey will be starting very soon, and we will be collecting data on at least the state of transparency in budgeting. And I'm very eager to look forward to it as well. I really am, but I don't want to make any predictions right now. Regarding inclusive populations, IBP has been working it's a recent strand of work, which is public participation, as you know, Juan Pablo. Mm-hmm. And there's a strong belief that giving voice to marginalized and vulnerable communities through public participation will bring those issues to fore. So we, speaking from IBP, on behalf of IBP, strongly support opportunities for public participation and including those communities to truly give a voice in budget policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone has some thoughts on these two important issues? Pedro, the World Bank main goal is the reduction of poverty. And my guess is that the challenge is greater than ever. Share your thoughts with us on this topic.
Yes, thank you, Juan Pablo. Reducing poverty and inequality. We have twin goals, and both of them are under threat, always under threat, and particularly now. this is having an impact on people's life, for sure. This is not about, it's about discussing the magnitude, but at the moment, the magnitude is not the type of discussion. We know that this is leaving a very strong mark, particularly on vulnerable populations, and it's going to last for a while. Maybe the pandemic, hopefully the pandemic, it's, I don't know how to make predictions for that, but we don't know the severity, but it will last and it will disappear eventually. But the effect in some cases can last for years, and the economic and social recovery will take time. So we know that for a fact. So thinking of how to address and reach those populations, that local level, because sometimes there's correlation, those lagging regions, you know, because it's not about the country, it's about the areas of the country. I mean, in a small country like the one I'm talking right now, which is Croatia, the difference between some big cities or large cities and some lagging regions is huge in terms of how much information reaches there and how much they can absorb. So the efforts to reach in the local level, the lagging regions, and in order to translate this information for the audiences that can capture that, it's critical. And so that's, I think, the last point that I raised on being able to translate it to in a way that people can understand and link it to their challenges of day-to-day life is very important, of reaching the local level and the lagging regions. So I would say that we have an opportunity. I want to put it in positive, but to answer your questions, yes, it is having an impact and will have a lasting impact, and particularly in this area. So we need to probably scale up the efforts to reach out and to have even like a special business line or project that allows us to make sure that we drill down to that level and to those groups of people.
Thank you. Lorena, you were pointing out as the audience for the COVID-19 guide to governments, to civil society, to control institutions, assuming that they look at the guide, that they use it. Do you believe that we have the conditions for this to be a permanent trend? That's one. Again, talking about fiscal transparency, and in your experience in the Mexican government for many years at the Hacienda Ministry, the Treasury, Ministry of Finance, how do you reach out for inclusion and for marginalized groups?
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I think I'm positive about how this will affect fiscal transparency. Not in the short run, but in the longer run. And not because stakeholders will certainly want to be more transparent, but for a simple thing. It's that many governments are having to change their processes right now from in-person processes to systems. So this is the case of many countries, that they're pushed to systematize the way they're doing things. And I'm thinking immediately of the case of Rwanda, that they changed the signature of papers because of COVID-19, and now they're doing it all through their FMIS. And that will allow to have the data that was not available to them before. And that will in turn at some point enable, because now at least you have the data. So I am positive in that sense, because it's not, the data availability, when it's systematized, it's easier to make transparent, as in the case of Colombia. When you have it, then you can talk about publishing. Otherwise, you need to go a step back and talk about gathering. So I am positive in that sense. Of course, not in the short run, because of all the decision-making that's going on right now. And about the marginalized groups and how to reach to these audiences, I think that the most important thing is to think outside of the box. So we're always thinking about data portals, or if you publish the data, then that's it. And there's a big myth that marginalized groups require less disaggregated data. And that's one of the biggest myths. If you want to reach out to people at the local level, then you need the data of their school. Then you need more disaggregated data. And one more thing, and this is thinking outside of the box. It's not just about data portals, but what can you do with them? For example, the cases of, you can, in one community, I don't remember if it's in Colombia or in another Latin American country, citizens can call a number and they can ask with their voice to Google anything. And Google translates this to a question and they get their answer on a phone. That's done with data. So you need more data to reach out the communities that have less access to internet. To have artificial intelligence work, you actually need more data, not less data, to make less technological solutions to reach out to this community. So it's about thinking outside of the box and what can work. I'm also thinking of the hackathon we had with the IMF last year in Costa Rica, on how to make the transfers, the program benefits transfers to these very far away communities, so that they don't have to go to the bank and get the money. That's with more technology and more data inside of the treasury to reach out these more marginalized communities. So we don't need to put the burden of technology to the marginalized or the vulnerable person, but we can use it to make the inclusion happen. So, yeah.
Thank you. So technology at their service. But for that to happen, as you mentioned, we need to not only think outside of the box, but we also need to train and to work a lot on public service for this to happen. What are your thoughts, both Suki and Leonardo, who work as we speak in the field with normal and well endowed organizations, but also with marginalized communities? Suki.
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, just, I mean, taking from Swad's reluctance to predict the future, I'm quite happy to predict the future, and potentially, with a condition, which is that, what we are seeing now around fiscal transparency and the demands is that it is very much, and I agree with everyone, quite a decisive opportunity that I think, that the pandemic is offering quite a specific moment, and in particular in South Africa, it's a moment in history as well for many reasons. It coincides with, Juan Pablo, earlier you were talking about complementary processes or interventions or enabling, processes. And at the moment, we have a reform in procurement happening. We have a reform in the National Health Insurance Bill, all happening within the very same time frame. And all of those require quite a lot of transparency, both from a fiscal perspective and much broader systematically. So I think it's a moment, and I think it's a moment for civil society to really harness, both in the medium term and in the long term. The question then is, how do we do that? And how do we do that in a highly political space as well, in a political time? So I don't know the how, but I think definitely that the implications for our sector in terms of fiscal transparency, or the fiscal transparency sector, are positive. I think they are really, really positive, and the likelihood of more meaningful, transformative transparency being, being realized in the medium term even are quite high. Attached to that are some really exciting, and I think when you speak of inclusion, Juan Pablo, one of the most exciting things that's happened in response to COVID-19 right now is that, in addition to the president making some very strong declarations and pronouncements and instructions, there are also, there's also with the Supreme Audit Institution has undertaken real-time auditing of 16 public entities, specifically around COVID-19 contracting. But alongside that, has specifically requested civil society organizations to provide information pre-audit and information from the ground about what's happening in communities. Not in any sophisticated audit process, nothing, really quite a social audit sort of manner, which means that, you know, for example, in one particular group where we have community-based organizations, and we've been asking, the Auditor General would like to know what's happening in your community. Tell us, you know, and the responses have been fantastic in a sense. You know, firstly, people say, yeah, as if they will use this information. And on the other hand, suddenly realizing in the first report that came out from the Auditor General, there were indications that civil society inputs had been utilized, and not just sophisticated civil society inputs, but really from people who were saying, my school, there was no water delivered, water tanks are there, but they're empty. The food that was delivered was substandard, the masks were suboptimal, and so on. Very real time and meaningful information. So that for me, the inclusion aspect means that those who are seeing what's happening need not have, you know, platforms and fancy tracking and so on to be included and to have their voices heard. But WhatsApp is good enough. The parliamentary context, for instance, there are committees who are enabling people in communities to make submissions using voice notes via WhatsApp. And so there is a lot that, if harnessed and used in this moment, can really increase inclusion and participation, but also actually see us doing some amazing things in the context of fiscal transparency.
Thank you. Let me now go to Colombia. Leonardo, again, how is the Ministry of Finance, what are you guys doing in Colombia to make sure that these efforts are sustainable? And how are you coming about the issue of inclusion?
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I think very quickly, but because I think you can hear there's a noise in the neighborhood. I don't know what it is, but very quickly, yes, we are very, in the ministry, we are working a lot with, for marginalized communities. We have been discussing with GIFT this subject before in other meetings about gender equality, information for gender equality. We are learning a lot. We are working a lot in this subject, and also money for from the state for ethnic minorities. We think that the information available, public information, and that money oriented to these minorities and communities is very important, and we need a different oversight. That we're learning a lot with all the information you have shared with us. And finally, I wanted to stress something that Lorena mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, in which we have learned about the information during this pandemic and this emergency. We think that we need to extend to a bigger emergency, which is the climatic crisis, which is a very important challenge that we will have in the next few years. In this decade, what we do, it's very crucial, very important in order to save our planet. That's it.
Thank you. And thank you all for your participation, for sharing your experience, your knowledge. We're on time, so thank you also for your questions of people looking at this session. I'll leave it there, and let's continue this conversation as it is so important that we ensure that the transparency, inclusion are a part of the work we do on the use of public resources. So again, Suad, Lorena, Pedro, Leonardo, Suki, thank you very much. Have a great day.